At 8:06 in the morning on December 7th, 1941, a single bomb fell from the sky above Pearl Harbor and changed the course of history. The bomb, actually an armor-piercing shell from a Japanese battleship that had been converted into an aerial weapon, penetrated the forward deck of the USS Arizona near Turret 2 and detonated somewhere in the vicinity of the battleship's forward magazines. 7 seconds later, those magazines exploded with such catastrophic force that the blast vented through the sides of the ship, destroying much of the forward interior structure. The forward turrets and conning tower collapsed downward 25 to 30 feet. The foremast and funnel collapsed forward. Debris showered down on Ford Island. The explosion killed 177 of the 512 men aboard, nearly half of all Americans who would die that morning. The Arizona settled to the bottom of Pearl Harbor, burning for 2 days, her back broken, her crew entombed within her hull. Today, more than 80 years later, the ship still lies where she sank. Oil still leaks from her ruptured fuel tanks, rising to the surface in a slow, steady seep that some have called the tears of the Arizona. More than 2 quarts every day, year after year, decade after decade. The ship is still bleeding. She is still dying. And she is still, in some profound way that defies easy explanation, still serving. This is the story of the USS Arizona, how she was built to embody American power, how she died in an attack that thrust America into global war, and how her wreck became the most sacred shrine of that war, a grave, a memorial, and a warning that remains relevant today. The USS Arizona was born in an era when battleships were the measure of national power and the instruments through which great nations projected force across the world's oceans. In the early 20th century, the development of the dreadnought battleship, pioneered by Britain's HMS Dreadnought in 1906, had revolutionized naval warfare. These new capital ships mounted batteries of large-caliber guns, all of the same size, allowing them to engage enemies at ranges where older mixed armament ships would be helpless. The result was an international arms race, as major powers competed to build larger, faster, more heavily armed battleships. The United States, emerging as a global power following the Spanish-American War and determined to protect its interests in both the Atlantic and Pacific, committed to building a modern battle fleet that could compete with Britain, Germany, and Japan. This commitment accelerated dramatically after World War I, when the United States found itself with global responsibilities but insufficient naval strength to guarantee its security. The Pennsylvania-class battleships, of which Arizona was the second and final member, represented the cutting edge of American naval design in the mid-1910s. These ships displaced over 31,000 tons fully loaded, measured over 600 feet in length, and mounted 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, the most powerful armament afloat when they were designed. The armor protection followed the all-or-nothing principle pioneered in the earlier Nevada class, which meant that rather than spreading armor thinly across the entire ship, the designers concentrated maximum protection around the magazines and machinery spaces, while leaving less critical areas unarmored. The theory was sound. Enemy shells would either strike the heavily armored citadel and be defeated, or strike unarmored areas where damage would be manageable. What this design could not account for was what would happen if a bomb penetrated the armored deck and detonated directly inside a magazine. That question would not be answered until December 7th, 1941. The keel of Battleship No. 39 was laid on the morning of March 16th, 1914 at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, with Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in attendance. The builders intended to set a world record 10 months from keel laying to launch for what the New York Times declared would be the world's biggest and most powerful super dreadnought ever constructed. The schedule proved optimistic. The ship was only half complete a year after the keel was laid, and she would not be launched until June 19, 1915, about 15 months after construction began. In the meantime, the ship was named Arizona, in honor of the newest state in the Union, which had been admitted in 1912. The launch itself was a spectacular public event. An estimated 75,000 people attended, including the mayor of New York City, the governor of Arizona, and numerous high-ranking military officials. Several warships were anchored nearby as an honor guard. Esther Ross, daughter of a prominent Arizona citizen, served as ship sponsor. In a symbolic gesture acknowledging Arizona's recent passage of prohibition legislation, 2 bottles were used in the christening, one filled with sparkling wine from Ohio and another filled with water from the Roosevelt Dam. After the launch, Arizona was towed to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for fitting out the process of installing engines, weapons, electronics, and all the systems necessary to transform a hull into a functional warship. Arizona was commissioned on October 17, 1916, with Captain John McDonald in command, following shakedown training that was interrupted by turbine damage, requiring 4 months of repairs. Arizona entered service just as the United States was entering World War I, but while that war transformed the world and demonstrated the terrible destructive capacity of modern weapons, Arizona never saw combat. She spent the war years based in the York River, serving as a gunnery training ship for crews manning armed merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic in convoys. 8 of her 5-inch secondary guns were removed to equip merchant ships. The ship rarely ventured into open ocean for fear of U-boats, and when she did, it was only in company with other battleships and escorts. Coal-fired American dreadnoughts were eventually sent across the Atlantic to serve with the British Grand Fleet, but Arizona, which burned oil, was not among them. The war ended in November 1918, without Arizona ever having fired a shot in anger, but she did play a small role in the peace that followed. In December 1918, Arizona was part of the massive naval escort that accompanied President Woodrow Wilson aboard the ocean liner George Washington as he sailed to France for the Paris Peace Conference. 10 battleships and 28 destroyers escorted the president into Brest for a single day before departing. The fleet returned to New York on December 26th to celebrations and a full naval review with Arizona leading the line and rendering a 19-gun salute. In the months that followed, Arizona was deployed to the eastern Mediterranean to represent American interests during the Greco-Turkish War, arriving at Smyrna just as Greek forces were landing in the city. American citizens fleeing the chaos sought shelter aboard the battleship until the crisis abated. In January 1921, Arizona transited the Panama Canal and joined the Pacific Fleet, which would be her home for the remainder of her career. For the next 2 decades, Arizona's service consisted of routine training exercises, fleet problems, port visits, and the occasional special duty. Naval historian Paul Stilwell remarked that the Pacific years included a great deal of sameness and repetition, with chronologies filled with phrases like torpedo defense practice, battle practice rehearsal, gunnery practice, en route to and anchored at. The recurring theme of these years were the annual fleet problems large-scale exercises that simulated combat conditions by having most of the active fleet divided into opposing forces. These exercises tested tactics, equipment, and command abilities. Interestingly, Fleet Problem 13 in February 1932 involved a simulated carrier attack on Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning, eerily prefiguring what would happen 9 years later. Between major exercises, Arizona's crew won rowing competitions. The ship participated in naval reviews for visiting presidents and life aboard, settled into the rhythms of peacetime naval service. But beneath this routine, the ship underwent significant changes. In 1929, Arizona entered Norfolk Navy Yard for a comprehensive modernization that would take 2 years. The old hyperboloid cage masts were replaced with modern tripod masts, topped with fire control directors. The number of 5-inch guns was reduced from 22 to 12, but they were repositioned 1 deck higher, where they would be less vulnerable to sea spray. Anti-aircraft armament was upgraded with the addition of 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. The main gun turrets were modified to increase the maximum elevation from 15 to 30 degrees, significantly extending their range. Most dramatically, The ship's machinery was almost entirely replaced. Her original turbines were swapped for more powerful geared turbines, salvaged from the cancelled Battleship Washington, and 6 new boilers replaced the originals. Torpedo bulges were added to the hull to improve underwater protection. The ship's armor was increased with the addition of special treatment steel on the decks. When Arizona emerged from the yard in 1931, she was in many ways a new ship, more capable, better protected, and ready for modern warfare. Sea trials demonstrated that despite the increased displacement from all these modifications, Arizona could still make over 20 knots. The 1930s brought both routine and drama. In March 1933, when an earthquake struck Long Beach, California, sailors from Arizona joined relief efforts providing food, treating the injured, and providing security. In 1934, the ship and her crew were filmed for the James Cagney film, Here Comes the Navy, which made extensive use of exterior footage and onboard location shots. That same year, Arizona collided with a fishing trawler off Cape Flattery, killing 2 men and resulting in a court-martial for the ship's captain. But as the decade wore on and international tensions increased, the frivolous incidents decreased. Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, its withdrawal from the League of Nations, and its increasing militarism made conflict in the Pacific increasingly likely. The United States began to take the Japanese threat seriously. Naval budgets increased, training intensified. Fleet problems became more realistic and more focused on the specific challenge of fighting Japan across the vast distances of the Pacific. In April 1940, following Fleet Problem 41, the Pacific Fleet was retained in Hawaiian waters and based at Pearl Harbor, rather than returning to its normal home port in California. The move was intended as a deterrent to Japanese expansion. The battleships, including Arizona, would remain at Pearl Harbor. The decision would prove fatal for some of them. The move to Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of the final chapter of Arizona's active service. The base itself was a natural harbor on the south coast of Oahu, protected by a narrow entrance and offering secure anchorage for the fleet. Ford Island in the center of the harbor provided mooring keys for battleships along its eastern and southeastern shores. These positions, known as Battleship Row, would hold 7 battleships on the morning of December 7, 1941. Arizona underwent a final refit at Puget Sound Navy Yard from October 1940 to January 1941. A foundation for search radar was added atop the foremast. Anti-aircraft directors were upgraded. A platform for 4 water-cooled 50 caliber machine guns was installed at the top of the mainmast. In January 1941, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd took command of Battleship Division 1 with his flag aboard Arizona. In February, Captain Franklin van Valkenburg assumed command of the ship. Both men would die aboard her 11 months later. On October 22, 1941, during an exercise in heavy fog, Arizona was struck in the bow by the battleship Oklahoma. The collision damage required dry docking at Pearl Harbor for repairs. Arizona had been scheduled to return to Bremerton Navy Yard in November for an overhaul. The collision kept her at Pearl Harbor instead. It was a piece of bad luck that would seal her fate. On December 6, 1941, the repair ship Vestal moored alongside Arizona to assist with minor repairs. That evening was quiet. Most of the crew were aboard, as liberty had been restricted in recent weeks due to tensions with Japan. Some men wrote letters home, others played cards or read. A few went ashore for a final night of entertainment in Honolulu. Nobody expected war, though the newspapers had been full of stories about deteriorating relations with Japan for weeks. Most sailors assumed that if war came, it would begin in the Philippines or Southeast Asia, where Japanese forces were already massing. Pearl Harbor, 5,000 miles from Japan, seemed safe. At approximately 7:55 a.m. on December 7th, air raid alarms began sounding across the harbor. Many sailors initially thought it was a drill, or that Army aircraft were conducting an unannounced exercise. That illusion lasted only seconds. Then the bombs began to fall. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the most carefully planned military operations in history. 6 aircraft carriers had sailed in complete radio silence across the North Pacific, approaching Hawaii from the north, where American patrol planes rarely ventured. At dawn on December 7th, the carriers launched 2 waves totaling 353 aircraft fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The first wave reached Pearl Harbor shortly before 8:00 a.m. The targets were clearly defined battleships, and aircraft carriers were priority targets, followed by cruisers, destroyers, and shore installations. The attackers had studied reconnaissance photographs and knew exactly where each ship would be moored. Arizona was berthed at Key F7 along the eastern side of Ford Island, outboard of the repair ship Vestal. The battleship Nevada was moored ahead of her. Tennessee and West Virginia were moored together astern of her, with West Virginia outboard. Oklahoma and Maryland were paired further astern. California was moored alone at the southern end of the row. 10 Nakajima B-5N2 Kate torpedo bombers, 5 each from the carriers Kaga and Hiryu, were assigned to attack Arizona. But these aircraft were not carrying torpedoes. The waters of Pearl Harbor were too shallow for standard aerial torpedoes. They would simply bury themselves in the mud without striking their targets. Instead, these bombers carried something far more deadly: 16-inch armor-piercing shells from Japanese battleships that had been modified with fins and fuses and converted into bombs. Each bomb weighed nearly 1,800 pounds. Dropped from 3,000 meters, they would strike with enough kinetic energy to penetrate armored decks before exploding. When the air raid alarm sounded aboard Arizona at 7:55 a.m., the ship went to general quarters. Men raced to their battle stations. Gun crews began preparing anti-aircraft weapons. Damage control parties stood ready with hoses and firefighting equipment. But there was no time. Shortly after 8:00 a.m., the bombers attacked. The aircraft from Kaga bombed Arizona from amidships to stern. The aircraft from Hiryu struck the bow area. In the space of minutes, 4 bombs hit the ship, and 3 near misses exploded close alongside. 1 bomb ricocheted off the face of turret 4 at the stern and penetrated the deck to explode in the captain's pantry, causing a fire. Another struck near the port edge of the ship, abreast the mainmast, likely detonating in the area of the anti-torpedo bulkhead. A third hit near the port rear 5-inch anti-aircraft gun. These hits caused fires and casualties, but the ship remained afloat and operational. Her guns were beginning to return fire. Then at 8:06 a.m. the 4th bomb struck. The bomb hit in the vicinity of turret 2, likely penetrating the armored deck near the forward magazines. About 7 seconds elapsed between the bomb strike and what happened next. Those 7 seconds allowed some men to shout warnings or begin to take cover. For most, it was not enough time. The forward magazines detonated in an explosion so powerful that it could be felt across the harbour. The blast vented primarily through the sides of the ship, blowing out massive sections of hull plating and destroying much of the interior structure forward of the mainmast. The forward gun turrets, each weighing over 800 tons, collapsed downward as the structure beneath them disintegrated. The conning tower, the armoured control station from which the ship was commanded in battle, collapsed with them. The foremast, a massive tripod structure carrying fire control equipment and spotting positions, toppled forward and smashed into turret 2. The forward funnel collapsed. Debris pieces of steel plate gun barrels, bits of equipment and human remains rained down across Ford Island and into the water. The fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. The concussion from the blast was so powerful that it temporarily extinguished fires burning aboard Vestal, which was still moored alongside. The ship broke in 2, though the sections remained connected by the keel and lower hull plating. Men who survived the initial explosion found themselves in a vision of hell. Fires raged throughout the forward half of the ship. Fuel oil that had leaked from ruptured tanks spread across the water and ignited, creating an inferno on the surface of the harbour. Men trapped below decks in compartments that had not been destroyed by the explosion were sealed in as flooding progressed, and hatches warped shut from the heat. Some drowned. Others suffocated as the air gave out. A few managed to escape through hatches or portholes, swimming through burning oil to reach safety. Men on the upper decks, many of them horrifically burned, jumped overboard and swam for Ford Island, or were picked up by small boats. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, the ship's damage control officer, organized firefighting efforts and evacuation of survivors despite being wounded himself. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. Captain Van Valkenburg, who had been in his cabin when the attack began, was seen making his way to the bridge just before the magazine explosion destroyed that entire section of the ship. He died at his post. Rear Admiral Kidd, who had also been trying to reach his command station when the bomb struck, was killed instantly. Both men were awarded posthumous Medals of Honor. The explosion killed approximately 177 of the 512 men aboard Arizona that morning, more than 3/4 of her crew. It was by far the highest death toll of any ship attacked that day. To put this in perspective, Arizona's casualties represented nearly half of the total American deaths at Pearl Harbor, which numbered 2,403. The speed and completeness of the ship's destruction meant that hundreds of men had no chance to escape. They died at their duty stations or were trapped below decks as the ship settled to the bottom. Many of the dead were never recovered. Their remains are still entombed within the hull, which is why Arizona is considered both a shipwreck and a war grave. For 2 days after the attack, fires continued to burn aboard the wreck. The heat was so intense that salvage efforts could not begin until the fires burned themselves out. When the smoke finally cleared, the extent of the damage was obvious. The forward half of the ship had been destroyed. The hull had settled evenly on the bottom of the harbour in about 40 feet of water. The aft section, though damaged, remained relatively intact. But there was no question of salvaging or repairing her. The ship was dead. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the American public in a way that is difficult to overstate. The United States had been technically at peace. The attack had come without warning. Indeed, the Japanese declaration of war was delivered to the State Department after the attack had already begun. Americans across the country gathered around radios to listen to reports from Hawaii. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, and asking for a declaration of war against Japan. Congress complied with only one dissenting vote. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States several days later. America was suddenly fully engaged in a global conflict that would last nearly 4 years and cost over 400,000 American lives. The Arizona became the symbol of that entry into war. Photographs of the burning battleship, her superstructure engulfed in flames and smoke billowing into the sky, were published in newspapers and magazines across the country. They represented American vulnerability, the surprise and treachery of the attack, and the lives lost. They also represented resolve. The attacks had destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet's battleship strength, but they had missed the aircraft carriers, which had been at sea during the attack. Those carriers would form the core of the American naval response in the Pacific. Arizona was officially placed in ordinary, declared temporarily out of service on December 29, 1941, and was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on December 1, 1942. Unlike most of the other ships damaged at Pearl Harbor, which were salvaged, repaired and returned to service, Arizona was judged too badly damaged to be worth the effort. Her surviving superstructure was cut away and scrapped. Salvage crews removed her main gun turrets over the next year and a half. The 2 aft turrets were taken ashore and installed as coastal artillery batteries, Battery Arizona at Cahey Point and Battery Pennsylvania on the Mokopu Peninsula. Battery Pennsylvania fired its guns for the first and last time on VJ Day in August 1945 during training exercises. Battery Arizona was never completed. The 2 forward turrets were left in place because they had collapsed into the wreck, but the guns from Turret 2 were salvaged, straightened, relined, and installed aboard the battleship Nevada in 1944. Nevada would later use these guns that had been aboard Arizona on the morning she died to bombard Japanese positions on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. In some symbolic way, Arizona struck back at the enemy who had killed her. For years after the war, the wreck of Arizona lay largely forgotten. The hull remained where it had sunk, a navigation hazard marked on charts, but otherwise ignored. Some Navy personnel proposed breaking up the wreck and removing it entirely. Others suggested leaving it in place as a memorial, but taking no formal action. In 1950, Admiral Arthur Radford, commander of the Pacific Fleet, instituted the practice of raising the American flag over the wreck each morning. It was a simple gesture, but it acknowledged that the ship, though destroyed, still deserved honor. Through the 1950s, momentum slowly built for creating a permanent memorial. Veterans groups, particularly the survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack and the families of those who had died, advocated for official recognition. In 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower approved the creation of a memorial to be built over the wreck. Funds were raised through public donations, benefit concerts, and government appropriations. The design chosen was by architect Alfred Price himself. A survivor of the attack, he had been interned as an enemy alien because of his Austrian birth and was later released and became an American citizen. His design was both simple and profound, a white concrete structure spanning the width of the sunken hull, with a large open central assembly area, a shrine room at one end, and viewing areas from which visitors could look down at the wreck beneath the water. The USS Arizona Memorial was dedicated on May 30th, 1962. It immediately became one of the most visited sites in Hawaii and one of the most emotionally powerful memorials in America. Visitors reach the memorial by boat from the visitor center on shore. As the boat approaches, the rusted barbette of Turret 3 is visible above the waterline, a stark reminder of the ship beneath. Once aboard the memorial, visitors gather in the shrine room, where a marble wall bears the names of all 177 men who died aboard Arizona on December 7, 1941. The names are arranged in order of rank, and reading them takes time. The list includes admirals and seaman officers and enlisted men, young men, barely out of high school, and career Navy veterans. Each name represents a life cut short, a family that received a telegram they had dreaded, a future that would never be realized. Through openings in the floor of the memorial, visitors can look down at the wreck. The rusted steel is clearly visible in the shallow water, and on calm days the oil slick is visible too, the slow, steady leak that continues more than 80 years after the ship sank. Some have called it the tears of the Arizona, others the black tears. But whatever the name, the phenomenon is the same. The ship is still bleeding oil from her ruptured fuel tanks, and she will continue to do so until the tanks are finally empty, or until the fuel breaks down chemically, a process that could take another 100 years or more. The decision was made in cooperation with the National Park Service, which administers the memorial, to leave the wreck largely undisturbed. Arizona is a war grave, and disturbing the remains would be disrespectful to the dead and to their families. Over the years, as survivors of the attack have died, many have chosen to have their ashes interred with the ship returned to their fallen comrades. Navy divers place the cremated remains within the hull through openings that allow access without disturbing the structure. Veterans who served aboard Arizona at other times in her career have had their ashes scattered in the water above the wreck. The last survivor of Arizona, Lou Conter, died in April 2024 at the age of 102. With his death, the final living link to the ship was broken. Everyone who served aboard her, everyone who was present during the attack, everyone who survived, they are all gone now. Only the ship remains, and the memories. There is a common but incorrect belief that Arizona remains in commission perpetually, an active unit of the United States Navy like the USS Constitution. This is not true. Arizona was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register in 1942 and has never been recommissioned. However, she does retain certain honors. She is authorized to fly the American flag as if she were an active commissioned vessel, the only decommissioned ship in the Navy with this privilege. The Navy retains title to the wreck, though the National Park Service controls access and administration. These are symbolic recognitions that Arizona, though dead, still serves. She serves as a memorial to those who died. She serves as a reminder of the cost of unpreparedness and the price of freedom. She serves as a warning that peace cannot be taken for granted and vigilance cannot be relaxed. In 2004, the Navy and National Park Service conducted a comprehensive computerized mapping of the hull using sonar and other non-intrusive technologies. The mapping revealed details of the damage, the condition of the structure, and the ongoing deterioration of the wreck. The question of how to manage the continued leakage of oil has been studied extensively. The Navy considered various methods of stopping or reducing the leaks, but all options posed risks of further damage to the structure or of disturbing the remains of the crew. The decision was made to monitor the situation, but take no immediate action. The wreck continues to deteriorate slowly, as all steel structures submerged in seawater eventually must. At some point in the future, decades from now, perhaps longer, the structure will collapse further. The visible portions will disappear beneath the harbour bottom. But that time has not yet come, and when it does, the memorial will remain. The legacy of the USS Arizona extends far beyond the waters of Pearl Harbor. Artifacts from the ship are displayed in museums and memorials across the country. One of the ship's original bells is in the bell tower of the University of Arizona Student Union, where for decades it was rung after every football victory. A gun mast and anchor from Arizona are displayed in Wesley Bolin Memorial Plaza in downtown Phoenix, paired with a gun from the Battleship Missouri to represent the beginning and end of America's war in the Pacific. Items from the ship's silver service ornate pieces that were used for formal dinners and ceremonies are on permanent exhibit in the Arizona State Capitol Museum. Every 2 years, the Navy awards the USS Arizona Memorial Trophy to a ship that has achieved the highest combat readiness in strike warfare, surface fire support, and anti-surface warfare. The trophy provided by the citizens of Arizona serves as a reminder that the ship's name still carries meaning and honor within the fleet. But the real legacy of Arizona is less tangible and more profound. She represents a moment when America's sense of security was shattered, when isolation was no longer possible, when the choice was made to fight rather than submit. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified the country in a way that few events in American history have matched. In the days and weeks following December 7th, young men lined up at recruiting stations in numbers that overwhelmed the processing systems. Industries shifted to war production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The entire nation mobilized for total war. That mobilization was driven partly by anger and partly by fear, but it was also driven by the images of burning ships and the lists of casualties. Arizona and her dead became symbols of why America was fighting. They were the answer to anyone who questioned whether the war was necessary or whether the sacrifices being demanded were justified. 83 years have passed since that Sunday morning in December. The world has changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the men who died aboard Arizona. The Cold War came and went. Japan transformed from enemy to ally. New wars and new threats emerged. But Pearl Harbor remains a touchstone in American memory, and Arizona remains at its center. Over 2 million people visit the Arizona Memorial each year, making it one of the most visited sites administered by the National Park Service. They come from across America and around the world. They come because Arizona represents something universal: the human cost of war, the courage of those who serve, the importance of remembering sacrifice. School groups learn about Pearl Harbor and World War II through the lens of this single ship and her crew. Veterans of later wars pay their respects to the sailors who died a generation before their own service. Foreign visitors confront the consequences of decisions made by their own nations decades ago. The ship still bleeds. Oil still rises from the ruptured tanks, creating rainbow sheens on the surface of Pearl Harbor. Some people find this phenomenon disturbing, a reminder that the past is never truly past, that the wounds of war persist long after the fighting ends. Others find it fitting, a perpetual remembrance, the ship herself ensuring that what happened here will never be forgotten. Scientists who have studied the leakage estimate that Arizona still contains hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel oil in her tanks. At the current rate of leakage, the fuel could continue seeping out for another 100 years or more. Eventually, the tanks will empty. Eventually, the last molecule of Arizona's fuel will rise to the surface and disperse. Eventually, the ship will stop bleeding, but not yet. Not for a long time yet. Until that day comes, the USS Arizona will continue to serve, as she has served since December 7th, 1941, not as a weapon of war, but as a memorial to those who died in war, a warning about the cost of war, and a reminder that freedom is never free. She is a ship that still bleeds a crew, that still waits, and a story that still demands to be told.